Dust never settled on Larkspur Station. It just moved from one corner to another, pushed by old fans that groaned every few seconds like tired animals. Wren Halden liked that sound. She liked most sounds that other people found annoying, because they meant something was still working, still alive, still trying. She was 8 years old and small for her age, with short brown hair that never stayed brushed and knees that were always scraped from climbing where she was not supposed to climb. Her father, Cale Dorset, often said she had more curiosity than sense, and she never argued with him because it was true. That morning the station was not calm. Ships from the threefold Concorde had arrived overnight, 3 of them, heavy and grey, docking at the far end of the station where cargo usually came through. Wren was not supposed to know about it, but she always knew things she was not supposed to know. She had heard 2 guards talking near the mess hall, saying words like dangerous and unstable and last resort. By midday, the whole colony knew something was different. Shops closed early. Parents pulled their children inside. Cale came home early from his shift, his hands still smudged with grease from the station's old life support systems, and told Wren to stay in their quarters. She did not listen. She never really did. The containment yard was on the lower ring of the station, a wide open space usually used for storing broken machinery. Now it held something else. Wren pressed herself against a stack of crates and watched as soldiers in Concorde uniforms guided something enormous through the gates. It was a dragon. Not the kind from the old picture books her mother used to read her, with soft scales and friendly eyes. This one was massive, its body covered in ash-colored plates that looked more like armor than skin, its wings folded tight against its back, its eyes a burning amber that seemed to notice everything at once. Thick chains wrapped around its legs and neck, humming faintly with restrained energy, and even those chains looked strained, as if they knew they were not enough. A woman walked beside the creature, keeping a careful distance. She wore the insignia of a Concorde handler, and her name, Wren would later learn, was Elira Sun. Elira's face was tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. It was the tired of someone who had failed at the same task too many times. This creature, Elira said to the station administrator, a heavyset man named Voss who had come down personally to oversee the transfer, has killed 17 handlers. 17, trained soldiers, engineers, even 2 of our best beast tamers. It does not submit. It does not bond. It only waits. Voss did not look concerned. He looked interested, the way a man looks at a new piece of equipment he plans to sell later for a profit. And yet here it is, he said, alive, which means someone thinks it's worth keeping. Someone thinks it's worth studying, Elira corrected. There's a difference. Wren did not understand all the words, but she understood the fear in the soldiers' movements, the way they kept their weapons raised even though the dragon was chained, the way nobody got too close. She had never seen an animal or anything treated with that much caution. She should have felt scared. Instead, she felt something closer to sadness. The dragon's eyes moved across the yard, taking in the guns, the chains, the crowd of frightened faces watching from a safe distance. There was no anger in its gaze, not yet. There was something worse, exhaustion, the look of a creature that had stopped expecting anything different. Then, without warning, one of the restraint chains sparked and failed. It happened fast. The dragon's tail swept low, knocking 2 soldiers off their feet. Its wings snapped open, sending crates and dust flying in every direction. Alarms blared across the yard, red lights flashing along the walls. Soldiers scattered, shouting orders that nobody followed, because there was no plan for this, no protocol that worked against something this strong. Wren's crate toppled sideways, and she tumbled out into the open, right into the path of the chaos. People screamed for her to run. Her father's voice, somewhere behind her, cracked with panic as he shouted her name. Elira lunged forward, too far away to help. Voss froze completely, useless in the moment that mattered. But Wren did not run. She did not know why. Later, she would try to explain it to herself and never quite manage it. It was not bravery, not exactly. It was something quieter. The dragon was not attacking the crowd out of hunger or cruelty. It was thrashing the way a trapped animal thrashes, the way something in pain moves when it has no other language left to speak. So instead of running, Wren stood very still in the open yard, dust swirling around her small frame, and watched the massive creature turn its burning amber eyes directly toward her. The soldiers stopped shouting. The alarms kept blaring, but for a moment it felt like the whole station was holding its breath, waiting to see what the dragon would do to the one person who had not fled. Time did strange things in moments like this. Wren would remember later that everything seemed to slow down, the dust hanging in the air instead of falling, the shouts of the soldiers turning into a low blur of noise. All she could really hear was her own heartbeat, and all she could really see was the dragon. It towered over her, easily 3 times the height of her father, its chest rising and falling with heavy, ragged breaths. Broken pieces of chain still hung from its front legs, sparking faintly. Its wings were half spread, casting a long shadow across the yard, blocking out the overhead lights. Up close, she could see scars along its neck and shoulders, old wounds that had healed wrong, evidence of years spent fighting people who wanted to control it rather than understand it. Someone screamed her name again. She thought it might be her father, but the sound felt far away, like it belonged to a different moment than the one she was standing in. Wren did not run. Instead, slowly, carefully, she lowered herself down and sat on the dusty ground, right there in the open yard, in full view of the creature that had just broken free of chains, strong enough to hold down a starship. It was not a plan. She did not think about tactics or safety. She only knew that when her neighbor's dog used to get scared during storms, sitting down and speaking softly always helped more than shouting or grabbing at it. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. "It's okay," she said, her voice small but steady. "I'm not going to hurt you." The dragon's head snapped toward her, amber eyes narrowing. A low sound rumbled from deep in its chest, something between a growl and a groan. Behind her, she heard Elira's voice, sharp and urgent, telling the soldiers to hold their fire. "Not yet, not yet." "I know you're scared," Wren continued, even though her own hands were trembling in her lap. "Everyone here is scared of you. That's probably why you're so angry. Nobody's ever just sat with you, have they?" The dragon's growl faded into something quieter. Its massive head lowered slightly, bringing its eyes level with hers, close enough now that she could feel the heat of its breath. She could see her own reflection in its amber eyes, small and dusty and unafraid. Elira had gone very still, watching from the edge of the yard, her hand raised to stop any soldier from moving. She had studied this creature for months, had read every report from every handler who had failed before her, and none of them, not one, had ever tried this. Every single person before had approached the dragon as a problem to solve, a threat to neutralize, a weapon to control. Nobody had simply sat down and talked to it like it was a frightened animal instead of a monster. "Voss," Elira said quietly, without taking her eyes off the scene in the yard, "tell your people to stand down, all of them, now." Voss, still frozen near the entrance, gave a stiff nod, and the soldiers slowly lowered their weapons, though none of them looked happy about it. The dragon's breathing began to slow. The tension in its massive shoulders eased, just slightly, the way a held breath finally releases. It studied Wren for a long moment, its amber eyes moving over her face as if searching for the trick, the trap, the hidden weapon that every other human had carried in one form or another. It found none. Wren reached out slowly, the way she might reach toward a nervous animal, palm open, fingers relaxed. She did not touch the dragon. She simply held her hand there in the space between them and waited. What happened next would be talked about across the entire station for years afterward, retold so many times that some details would change with each telling. But the core of it never would. The dragon knelt. Its front legs bent, lowering its massive body toward the ground, its head dipping down until it was almost level with the small girl sitting in the dust. The chains still hanging from its legs clinked softly against the metal floor. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of soldiers and colonists watching from the edges of the yard, the sound of dozens of people realizing, all at once, that they were witnessing something that should not have been possible. Cale pushed through the crowd, his face pale, reaching his daughter's side in seconds, but even he stopped a few feet away, staring at the impossible sight in front of him. His daughter, sitting calmly on the ground, and beside her, kneeling like some ancient creature paying respect to a king, the dragon that had killed 17 trained handlers. Elira walked forward slowly, her boots crunching against the scattered dust and broken chain links. She stopped a respectful distance away, studying the dragon's posture, its lowered head, the way its amber eyes remained fixed on Ren and nothing else. "In all my years," Elira said quietly, mostly to herself, "I have never seen anything like this." Voss, recovering his composure now that the danger seemed to have passed, allowed himself a slow, calculating smile. Whatever this was, whatever had just happened in the containment yard, he already understood one thing clearly. It was valuable. News moved fast on a station as small as Larkspur, faster than any official announcement could keep up with. By the next morning, every person in the colony had heard some version of the story, and most versions had already grown taller than the truth. Some said the girl had spoken an ancient language. Others said she had used a hidden device. Nobody wanted to believe the simplest explanation, which was also the true one: she had just been kind. Elira requested a private meeting with Kale that morning in a small office near the containment yard that still smelled faintly of burnt metal from the day before. She looked like she had not slept, and in truth, she had not. "I need to understand what happened," she said, sitting across from him, her hands folded tightly on the table. "Not the story everyone is repeating, what actually happened." Kale rubbed his eyes, exhaustion pulling at every line of his face. "My daughter sat down and talked to it. That's what happened. I don't have a better explanation than that." Elira shook her head slowly. "You don't understand what that creature has been through. It was taken from its home world 3 years ago, after its own people were wiped out in a conflict that had nothing to do with it. Every handler since then has tried a different method. Sedation, reward systems, dominance training, isolation, nothing worked. It attacked every single one of them, eventually, no matter how careful they were." "Maybe," Kale said quietly, "none of them actually tried talking to it like it mattered." Elira did not have an answer for that. Over the following days, something unusual began happening in the containment yard. Ren, despite her father's protests and Voss's growing interest, kept returning. She brought food scraps from the station kitchens, sat near the massive creature for hours at a time, and talked to it about anything and everything: her school lessons, the shape of the stars outside the station windows, the way the old fans in her quarters groaned like tired animals. She named it Soot because of the ash-dark color of its scales, and because it felt wrong to keep calling something that large and that alive simply the creature. Soot did not speak, not in any language the humans understood, but it listened. It watched her with those burning amber eyes every single time she visited, and slowly, the tension in its massive body began to ease. The scars along its neck stopped looking so raw. It began eating regularly for the first time since its capture. It stopped straining against the remaining restraints. Elira observed all of this from a careful distance, taking notes, comparing it against everything she had learned in her years as a Concord handler. What she was seeing did not match anything in her training. The Concord's entire approach to dangerous creatures was built around control, around establishing dominance quickly and firmly before the creature could establish it first. Trust was considered a weakness, an opening for disaster. And yet here was a small human child, breaking every rule of Concord handling, and somehow succeeding where 17 trained professionals had failed and died trying. "You're not doing anything I taught anyone to do," Elira told Ren one afternoon, watching the girl rest her small hand gently against Soot's massive front leg. "I'm not trying to make him do anything," Ren said simply, not looking up. "I'm just being his friend." Voss, meanwhile, saw the situation very differently. He had already sent reports up through the colony's administrative channels, framing the story in the most dramatic terms possible. A human child taming the untamable dragon. It made for excellent publicity, the kind that could bring funding, attention, and resources to a struggling frontier station that desperately needed all three. He began arranging small demonstrations, inviting other colony officials to witness Ren and Soot together, always careful to stand at a safe distance himself while praising the historic bond for the cameras. Kale grew increasingly uneasy, watching his daughter treated less like a child and more like a tool for the station's benefit. "She is not a show for you to put on," Kale said sharply, cornering Voss outside the containment yard one evening. "She's the reason funding is finally coming back to this station," Voss replied coolly. "Do you understand what that means for everyone here? For your daughter's future, I would think you'd be grateful." "I'd be grateful if you stopped treating an 8-year-old like a business opportunity." Voss did not respond to that, only smiled thinly and walked away, already planning the next demonstration. Elira watched the exchange from a distance, and for the first time in a long while, she found herself agreeing more with the frightened, protective father than with her own colony's administrator. Something about the bond between Ren and Soot felt different from anything she had studied before, something fragile and real that did not belong in a spotlight or a funding report. She began to wonder, quietly, whether the Concord's entire approach to creatures like Soot had been wrong from the very beginning, built on fear and control when it should have been built on patience and trust. It was a dangerous thought for a Concord handler to have, and she knew it. But watching Soot rest his massive head near Ren's small shoulder each afternoon, calm and content for the first time in 3 years, made the thought impossible to ignore. Word of the bond was already spreading beyond Larkspur Station, further than Elira or Kale realized, reaching ears that would not see it as something beautiful at all, but as something to be reclaimed, corrected, or destroyed. 3 weeks after the day Soot knelt in the containment yard, a ship arrived at Larkspur Station that nobody had invited. It did not dock at the usual cargo bay. Instead, it requested emergency clearance directly to the administrative ring, citing Concord authority that overrode the station's normal procedures. Voss, eager to please anyone with real power in the Concord hierarchy, granted the request without asking too many questions, a decision he would come to regret. The visitors called themselves the Reclamation Division, a branch of the Concord that Elira had only heard about in quiet, uneasy conversations among senior handlers. Their leader, a stiff and humorless official named Dreeth, requested a meeting within an hour of landing. "We understand there has been an incident involving Concord property," Dreeth said, seated across from Voss and Elira in the station's main conference room. His voice was flat, businesslike, the tone of someone reading from a script he had used many times before. "The creature designated for containment at this facility has apparently formed an unauthorized bond with a human minor." "It's not an incident," Elira said carefully. "It's the first successful stabilization of that creature since its capture. I've documented significant behavioral improvement." "Stabilization was never the goal," Dreeth replied. "Control was the goal. A bond with an untrained civilian child is not control. It is an unpredictable variable, and unpredictable variables are precisely what the Reclamation Division exists to correct." Voss, sensing the direction of the conversation, tried to interject with talk of the positive publicity, the funding opportunities, the historic nature of the bond. But Dreeth cut him off with a single raised hand. "The creature will be transferred to Concord custody within 48 hours, Dreeth said, "along with full documentation of the bonding incident for study purposes. The child's involvement will no longer be necessary." Elira felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had read enough Reclamation Division reports over the years to know what custody and study purposes usually meant for creatures like Soot. It rarely ended with the creature surviving the process. Word reached Kale within the hour, carried by Elira herself, who had broken protocol to warn him directly. "They're going to take him," she said, standing in the doorway of Kale's quarters, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Not transfer him somewhere better. Take him apart, most likely, to understand why the bond worked, so they can replicate or prevent it elsewhere. Your daughter's involvement will be, in their words, no longer necessary." Kale's jaw tightened. "And Ren?" "They didn't mention Ren specifically, but I would not assume that means she's safe from their interest either." That evening, Kale tried to explain the situation to his daughter as gently as he could. choosing words that would not frighten her more than necessary. But Ren was not a child who missed the important parts of things, even when adults tried to soften them. "They want to hurt him," she said flatly, sitting on the edge of her bed, her small hands clenched into fists. "Because he trusts me now instead of being scared of everyone." "They see it as a problem to fix," Kale said quietly. "I don't agree with them, but they have more power here than we do." "That's not fair." "No," Kale admitted, "it isn't." Voss, for his part, spent the following day in a state of quiet panic, trying to salvage what he could from a situation quickly spinning outside his control. He had wanted publicity, funding, recognition for his station. He had not wanted a confrontation with the Reclamation Division, whose reputation for ruthless efficiency was well known even among administrators who rarely paid attention to Concord politics. He attempted, briefly, to argue for a compromise, some arrangement that would allow the station to keep documenting the bond while satisfying the division's demands. Dreeth dismissed the idea within minutes. "Compromise was never on the table, Administrator," Dreeth said coldly. "You should be grateful we are not investigating this facility's negligence in allowing the incident to occur in the first place." By the following morning, Dreeth's forces had begun preparing for the transfer, moving heavy equipment into the containment yard, including a suppression field generator powerful enough to neutralize even a creature as strong as soot. Elira watched the preparations from a distance, her earlier professional detachment completely gone, replaced by a growing, uncomfortable sense that she was standing on the wrong side of something important. She found Kale near the containment yard entrance, watching the same preparations with a face carved from stone. "There's still time before the transfer," she said quietly. "Not much, but some." "Time to do what?" Kale asked. "We don't have the authority to stop a Concord division from taking what they claim is their property." "No," Elira agreed, "but your daughter might have something more useful than authority." Kale turned to look at her, uncertain what she meant, and Elira nodded toward the containment yard, where the suppression field generators hummed to life, casting a pale blue glow across the enclosure, and where Soot, sensing the danger closing in around him, had begun to pace restlessly, his amber eyes scanning the crowd of unfamiliar soldiers for the one small face that was not among them. The transfer was scheduled for dawn. Nobody on Larkspur Station slept well that night, least of all a small girl lying awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, already deciding, quietly and without telling her father, exactly what she planned to do when morning came. The suppression field activated at dawn, exactly as scheduled. A low hum spread across the containment yard as the generators reached full power, and Soot staggered as the field wrapped around him, his massive muscles suddenly heavy and unresponsive, his wings drooping toward the ground. It was not pain, exactly, but something worse in its own way, a total loss of control over his own body, the same helpless feeling he had lived with for 3 long years before Ren had ever sat down beside him. Dreeth watched from a raised platform at the edge of the yard, arms folded, his expression unreadable. Around him, Reclamation Division soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, preparing heavy transport restraints designed specifically for creatures like Soot, restraints far stronger than the ones that had failed weeks earlier. Elira stood near the platform, her stomach twisted into knots, watching the operation unfold with a growing sense of helplessness. She had tried everything she could think of overnight: appeals to Concord regulations, requests for delay, arguments about the scientific value of further observation. Dreeth had dismissed every one of them without much interest. Kale arrived at the edge of the yard just as the restraints began locking into place around Soot's weakened legs, and his heart sank when he realized his daughter's bed had been empty when he checked it minutes earlier. "Ren," he shouted, pushing through the gathered crowd of soldiers and onlookers, panic sharpening his voice. "Ren." She was already there. She had slipped past the outer security line sometime before dawn, small enough and familiar enough with the station's back corridors to avoid notice, until it was too late for anyone to stop her easily. She stood now at the very edge of the suppression field, close enough that the pale blue light washed across her face, staring up at Soot as his massive body sagged under the weight of the restraints. "Get that child out of the containment zone," Dreeth ordered sharply, and two soldiers moved toward her immediately. Ren did not wait for them to reach her. She stepped forward, directly into the suppression field. The moment she crossed the boundary, something unexpected happened. The field, designed to neutralize the massive bioelectric energy running through Soot's body, registered her small human presence as an anomaly, an interference it was not calibrated to handle. The generators sputtered, their hum stuttering and uneven, the pale blue light flickering unsteadily. It was not enough to shut the field down completely, but it was enough to weaken it, just slightly, just long enough. Soot's amber eyes snapped fully open, no longer glazed with the heavy weight of suppression. He saw her, standing there in the flickering light, unafraid, the same way she had been unafraid weeks earlier when he had broken free of his first chains. And something in him, some deep reserve of strength that the suppression field had not accounted for, began to push back. "Get her out of there now," Dreeth shouted, his composure finally cracking. The soldiers hesitated, caught between orders to secure the creature and orders to retrieve the child, unsure which took priority in a situation nobody had planned for. Kale broke through the line himself, running toward his daughter, but Elira caught his arm. "Wait," she said, her voice tight. "Look." Soot was rising. Slowly, painfully, against the pull of the weakened but still active suppression field, he pushed himself back onto his feet, his massive wings unfurling despite the restraints still locked around his legs. The transport chains groaned under the strain, metal links straining against a strength that no piece of Concord engineering had ever fully accounted for, because no engineer had ever designed restraints for a creature fighting not out of rage, but out of something closer to love. "Soot," Ren said softly, reaching one small hand toward him even as the flickering field crackled around her. "I'm here. I'm not going to let them take you again." The dragon's roar shook the entire containment yard, not a sound of fury this time, but something closer to defiance, a refusal 3 years in the making finally given voice. The remaining restraints snapped one by one under the pressure, sending soldiers stumbling backward as broken chain links scattered across the ground. Dreeth shouted orders that nobody could hear over the chaos. Soldiers scrambled to reposition, uncertain whether to fire on a creature now standing protectively over a small human child, uncertain whether their own commander would even want that outcome given how it would look to the wider Concord. Soot lowered his massive head, positioning his body between Ren and the approaching soldiers. His wings spreading wide enough to block their view of her entirely. It was not an attack. It was a wall, built from scales and old scars and 3 years of pain, finally finding a purpose worth standing for. Around the edges of the containment yard, station colonists who had gathered to watch the transfer began to react, some gasping, some shouting encouragement, a few even stepping forward as if to help. Drawn by the sight of the creature, everyone had feared now standing guard over one of their own children instead of threatening her. Elira released Kale's arm and stepped forward herself, raising her voice over the chaos. "Dreeth, stand your soldiers down, now, before someone gets hurt that doesn't need to." For the first time since his arrival, Dreeth hesitated, watching the scene in front of him, the massive creature shielding a child, the crowd of colonists shifting from fear to something closer to solidarity, the suppression field flickering weakly under strain it had never been designed to withstand. It was, Elira realized with something close to hope, not a battle the Reclamation Division was prepared to win, not without consequences far larger than a single dangerous creature. The suppression field failed completely a few minutes later, its generators overheating from the strain of fighting against something they were never built to overcome. The pale blue light died out, and silence fell across the containment yard, broken only by the soft, ragged breathing of a dragon still standing protectively over a small girl. Dreeth stood frozen on his platform for a long moment, staring at the scene below him, calculating something behind his flat, unreadable expression. Around the yard, dozens of colonists had gathered, no longer hiding behind crates or watching from safe distances, but standing openly, witnesses to something that would be talked about across the sector for years to come. "This changes nothing," Dreeth finally said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "The creature remains Concord property, regardless of this display." "Does it?" Elira stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tension still thick in the air. "Because from where I'm standing, Dreeth, you have a station full of witnesses watching a Reclamation Division try to forcibly remove a creature from a child it has bonded with peacefully, using suppression technology that nearly caused a serious incident. I don't think that's the story your superiors want circulating through Concord channels." Dreeth's jaw tightened. He understood, better than anyone present, exactly how quickly stories like that could spread, and exactly how badly they could damage a division that relied on quiet, uncontested authority to function. Voss, who had been conspicuously silent throughout the entire confrontation, finally found his voice, sensing an opportunity to salvage something from the chaos. "Perhaps," he said carefully, stepping forward, "there's room for a different arrangement here, one that keeps the creature stable, keeps the Concord informed, and avoids any unnecessary publicity complications." For once, Kale found himself agreeing with the administrator's instincts, even if not his motives. Negotiations stretched through the rest of the day, tense and uncertain, but by evening an agreement had been reached. Soot would remain at Larkspur Station, officially registered as a Concord research subject under joint observation, with Elira assigned as permanent oversight instead of returning to her previous rotation. Dreeth's forces withdrew before nightfall, though the stiff official made it clear the arrangement would be reviewed periodically, a threat that Kale understood was unlikely to fully disappear. Voss received a quiet reprimand from his superiors for allowing the situation to escalate as far as it had, though the positive publicity that eventually followed, once the full story reached beyond the station, softened the consequences considerably. He remained administrator, though noticeably more careful afterward about which opportunities he chose to pursue. Wren, through it all, remained mostly unaware of the political maneuvering happening above her. She spent that evening exactly where she had spent most evenings for the past 3 weeks, sitting beside Soot in the containment yard, though the space had already begun to feel less like a containment yard and more like a home neither of them had expected to find. "You're staying," she told him, resting her hand against his front leg, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing beneath the ash-dark scales. "For real this time." Soot lowered his head until it rested gently beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, and let out a low, rumbling sound that Elira, watching from a respectful distance, had come to recognize over the past weeks as something close to contentment. "I still don't fully understand it," Elira admitted to Kale later that night, the two of them standing near the yard's entrance, watching Wren and Soot in comfortable silence. "Everything I was trained to believe about creatures like him said this shouldn't have worked. Fear and control were supposed to be the only languages strong enough for something that powerful." "Maybe fear and control were never really languages at all," Kale said quietly. "Maybe they were just the only ones anyone bothered trying." Elira considered that for a long moment, watching the way Soot's massive body curled protectively around the small girl leaning against him. The same creature that had once killed 17 trained handlers, now radiating a calm that no amount of suppression technology had ever managed to achieve. "I requested a permanent transfer to this station," she said eventually. "Effective immediately. I'd like to study this properly, not the way the Concord usually studies things, the way your daughter does." Kale allowed himself a small, tired smile, the first genuine one in weeks. "She'd probably tell you the same thing she told me. It's not that complicated. You just have to actually care." In the weeks and months that followed, Larkspur Station changed in ways nobody had fully anticipated. It became known across the frontier not just as a struggling colony on the edge of Concord territory, but as the place where the untamable dragon had knelt before an ordinary human child. A story that inspired both curiosity and quiet hope in people who had grown used to hearing only about conflict between humans and the wider galaxy. Other handlers, Other creatures deemed too dangerous or unstable for traditional methods occasionally found their way to Larkspur, drawn by rumors of a different approach, one built on patience instead of dominance. Elira, now leading a small but growing team, welcomed each new case with the same lesson she had learned from an 8-year-old girl who had simply refused to be afraid. Ren grew older, as children do, though she never quite lost the quiet, unassuming curiosity that had first led her toward the containment yard on that dusty, chaotic morning years earlier. She still visited Soot every day, though their conversations grew longer and more complicated as she grew, filled with questions about the stars, about the galaxy beyond the station, about all the other creatures out there who might simply be waiting for someone willing to sit down beside them instead of raising a weapon. And Soot, once feared across a dozen systems as a creature that could never be controlled, remained exactly where he had chosen to stay, loyal and gentle beside the one person who had never seen him as a monster at all, only as someone who needed a friend. It was not strength that had tamed him in the end. It was never really about control at all. It was about a small girl who sat down in the dust when everyone else ran and simply stayed.